All right. I want to welcome everybody to our webinar today, How to Build Fail-Proof Influencer Contracts. Uh, as we're getting more folks in, it's right at the top of the hour. People are coming back from lunch. They're starting lunch. Maybe they're getting a coffee. We're going to get started a couple of minutes past the hour. So we're going to sit on hold here for a couple of minutes. We'll get started about 1:02 Eastern. And then we'll jump right into our webinar content, but you're in the right place and we'll be speaking in a couple of moments. So we'll be right back. All right, everybody. I wanted to thank everybody for joining me today and my guest, Ethan, as well. Uh, you're here for Hype Auditor's Influencer How to Build Fail-Proof Influencer Contracts. We'll be running for about 30 or 35 minutes today, but I want to thank folks as they're joining. I want to remind everybody that this is being recorded. So we'll be posting a link to the live stream shortly after this. And if you want to send this along to a colleague, you can actually just forward the invite that you received. It's the exact same link as before, but you can always catch this on YouTube. You can share it with other colleagues that you might have, or folks that maybe even in your legal department that could use some tips today. We're going to start with a couple of housekeeping things as we're getting going. First of all, we have a lot of really cool first-hand experiences that we'll be diving into, a lot of tips, getting a lot of perspective from Ethan, who has a wealth of experience. If you have any questions, plan to go ahead and drop them in the comments. The goal is to go through questions at the end. So sometimes when we do these webinars, we go through them as we're going. Sometimes we wait till the end. This will be definitely at the end of the webinar. We'll be going through things. If you've joined our webinars in the past, you'll notice that I'm actually in a booth instead of in my normal office, so I have a little bit of a different screen situation. So bear with me if we fumble through any clicking or whatnot, but we'll go ahead and get started today. So just a brief intro to myself before we get to sort of our guest of honor. My name is Ryan Hilliard. I'm actually calling you from Raleigh, North Carolina. I saw we actually have somebody from Nova Scotia, which is really awesome. We got people from all over the world. Usually 80% of our registrants are global to these webinars, which is really, really cool. So if you have a moment, post where you're calling from or joining us from. That's always really, really interesting for folks to see. My role is I'm the general manager of North and South America here at Hype Auditor, helping marketing and sales, and we're talking with a lot of you folks around your specific needs. Nick from our team was able to find a tremendous guest who brings a wealth of experience when it comes to legal matters and influencer marketing, working with brands, working with agencies. Ethan Wall. Ethan, welcome. I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the group. Tell us a little bit about what you do, what your primary focus is, just so folks can get a little bit of context.
Thank you, Ryan. Great to be here and great to see people from across the world, including Juan from Miami. That's where our office is located. But not me. I am a nomadic social media lawyer. Yes, a social media lawyer is a real thing. I founded the world's first social media law firm back in 2015. Prior to that, I worked for a traditional law firm, said I was going to focus on social media. Managing partner looked at me like I was crazy. Fast forward 8 years, 8 books on social media law later, and thankfully social media is still around. We help brands, businesses, and creators protect and grow their online presence through contracts, compliance, intellectual property, and of course, influencer law. And seeing people from Nova Scotia, even from the Philippines, is awesome. I've been nomadic for 4 years now. I donated everything I own. We run the law firm remotely from around the world. This year from Patagonia, from Italy, England, Scotland, and now from Boulder, Colorado. So glad to be here with you, Ryan, to talk about all things influencer contracts.
It's awesome, Ethan. I mean, it's really cool to see Marley from the Philippines. I'm not really a homebody, but I've actually lived in Raleigh my entire life, and so it's admirable to see someone bounce around, and it's really cool to hear about sort of that nomadic approach to things. And I'm really looking forward to folks benefiting from your experience once again as you're joining us. Post questions that you have, anything that comes up specific or general, into the comments, and we'll be able to hit them at the end. We'll also share contact information to get a hold of either of us with your specific questions. But let's go ahead and get started today. Just a brief overview. It's always good to set the table for what we hope to accomplish today. We're going to dive into why contracts are important. I don't think that that's a spoiler if we're talking about building fail-proof contracts, and we have a lawyer with us, right? Contracts are important, why they actually matter. Some of the essential components of influencer contracts we'll dive into, and then we'll go into some real world examples of where contracts either helped or would have really helped in an awkward situation with actual cases that we've heard from some of our customers, and then we'll have plenty of time to do a Q&A. As a reminder for folks, we are recording this. The link to the live stream is the exact same link you're on right now on YouTube, so you can always go back and watch it. You can send that link to your colleagues and they can watch it themselves. So all of this will be referenceable in the future. Stick around to the end, right? I think more importantly, we'll have Q&A. Like I hope you guys bring practical use cases, try to stump Ethan. I told him I would not send him curveballs, but that doesn't prohibit you guys from sending your hardest questions. Now, keep in mind you haven't contracted with him as a legal professional, so he probably is not going to guarantee anything in this case. That's my disclaimer for his behalf, which maybe as a lawyer he would appreciate. But please, bring those questions to him. We also have these guides and templates, as well as a glossary of commonly used terms that we'll be sharing as a link at the end of this. So just stick around, or you can catch it on the YouTube later. Yeah, hashtag not legal advice.
I like that.
Awesome. So for everybody's context, you all don't see the attendee list, the people that come in and register. Even Ethan doesn't see it. So I wanted to share in terms of like the mix of people that we have. We have a very, very broad audience. So global for sure, but then also a mix of brands, agencies, and even influencers. And I tend to think that the influencers are coming to this to learn what is the deal with these contracts that I'm looking at? What should I be thinking about? And then brands and agencies, like, why are they important? Why should I be building them into my workflow? And then maybe for our larger brands and agencies, it's how can we streamline this process even a little bit better? Because sometimes things can get stuck in legal, and that's what we want to avoid. So with that context in mind, I'm going to open it up with a question for Ethan. We have a number of different reasons why we think contracts are important, but just at a really, really high level, when someone says to you, like, is this really necessary? Why, in your mind, like, are contracts important based off of what you've seen, what you've experienced firsthand, and a little bit of context that I gained from you before we got started was, you've worked on both sides of these negotiations and discussions with influencers, with brands. So you have two-sided perspective, but why, in your mind, are contracts so important?
Yeah, contracts are absolutely important. Here's the thing. We go into every single business deal with the expectation that everything is going to go great. And we've got the best of intentions, but spoiler alert, lawyers would not exist unless things went wrong. And if things do go wrong, people will pick up the phone and they'll call, and whether it's a brand or it's a creator, they'll say, hey, the other side didn't keep their part of the deal. What can we do about it? And I say the answer is, let me see your contract. And if there's no contract, there's really very little way for you to be able to get help in your situation, because the whole situation becomes he said, she said. I was told it was only supposed to be on my feed for a little while, but it was removed the next day. There's a disagreement about it, and now we have to settle this in court or in arbitration, or just not deal with it at all and not get what we ultimately promised. A contract is not only smart business, it's also really smart from a legal perspective, because the contract's going to lay out exactly who should do what. And if something goes wrong, what do we do about it? And having that contract usually helps to prevent problems before they arise, because everything is abundantly clear. And in the event that someone doesn't perform the way that they're supposed to, it's much easier to say, hey, look, the contract says this. Would you mind fixing it? People usually say, sorry, I totally missed that. Let me make good on that. And so for all of those reasons, having a contract is not really important. I think it's almost necessary, at least from a legal perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely agree. I think one of the perspectives, I'm not a social media lawyer, but I work with customers all the time on contracts. And one of the things that we see, we've outlined a number of reasons why you might be thinking about it, but it's all about setting expectations. Like sometimes your discussions are around some idea, and sometimes you don't have the same perspective as the person you're talking to. And so when you finally put it on paper, you go, okay, I thought we meant this. Oh no, I thought we meant, and now you can come together. And like you said, Ethan, like usually it's just a matter of like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll change that. Like redlining is usually not that painful if you all want to know where we're sort of coming from, what we're trying to achieve. But putting it down on paper is like the best way to just avoid any sort of confusions or misconceptions around what are we all talking about. Plus, like you said, if I thought that I was supposed to have perpetual usage rights and you're saying we didn't, it's the thing that you go back to and say, here's where you said we did, or no, it's not there. So there's nothing we can really do about it.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Awesome. So there's lots of reasons. I think we've encapsulated them, some of them here. Now we'll shift into essential components of an influencer contract. There's a lot of things that you can get into contracts, things that you want to incorporate. Before we get there, I want to get, this is not just for my benefit, this is actually for the benefit of the room. I'd love to hear from folks just in the chat how many campaigns you tend to run per month. Now, there is going to be a follow-up question to this a little bit later. How often are you using contracts in this? But I think it's good for us to understand, especially for Ethan's perspective, if people are running 1 or 2 contracts, that's a little bit of a different situation than if you're running 10 to 12, if you're running 50, if you've got all of these concurrent relationships and things going on. That can really shape what your legal strategy really should be, and maybe where you're probably at right now. So a couple of folks have jumped in. Everybody, Marley is in the other side of the world right now. It's 1 a.m. She was the first to respond with B, 1 to 3. Gabby, another B, 1 to 3. Garrett, actually more than 10. So a more mature influencer marketing initiative at his brand or agency. Not sure which one he's at. So I think representative sample, like it's going to be a mix, right? We see this regularly. People are either just getting started or they're doing something at scale. Trisha also mentioned something more at scale. So it's important to keep in mind, like, what components should you include? Now, maybe I should have looked a little bit ahead, but before you get to even like, I want to think about a contract, you want to also identify what are we trying to accomplish with this partnership with this influencer? Because what your goals are will probably dictate what your needs are. What do we need to have in place? If you're doing something as a short spurt for a campaign, it's going to run for Black Friday, Cyber Monday, which is not that far around the corner. Maybe perpetual usage rights don't make as much sense. You don't need to be thinking about that. But you want to establish, like, what are our goals? What are our expectations? What are our timelines? That ultimately can dictate how should we structure this contract. Because, and this will be a non-curveball question to you, Ethan, like, how often does the contract sort of change between influencers that you're partnering with? Is it the same contract every single time? Is it a variation of a template all the time? Is it completely different all the time in your experience?
In my experience, whether you're a brand or you're an influencer, it's always great to start with a contract template that can then be modified for your specific deals. And so when we work with brands or work with agencies or work with creators, usually we prepare an influencer contract that has The legal terms is almost a template. And then the addendum on the agreement might have the ability to modify what the services are going to be, what the payment is, what the timeline, and what the details are. And in this way, it's really helpful, let's say, if you're a brand or an agency, to know exactly what terms that you're comfortable with. You can then modify this for the scope of the influencer or for the job. Or if you're an influencer, you have your contract, which is great. And let's say that a brand wants to come to you and say, we need you to use our contract. You at least know from your perspective what it is that you're most comfortable with, where your contract aligns with the brand, and where you're willing to make changes or concessions, or where you really want to draw a line in the sand and have to get some concessions on payment if they're going to go against what's in your contract. But while every deal is different, I think the basic legal protections for contracts are pretty much the same. And so starting with a template that you can modify, I think is always a good place to start.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think one little note at the bottom that we have here, it's always good to express these objectives clearly to the influencer as well. You want to make sure that they know where you're coming from. You want that alignment. It helps make agreeing to different terms and concessions go much more smoothly, because they sort of get it. If you hide what your objectives are as a company, you're trying to sort of protect what you're doing. It's your information. That can really hinder relationships in general. And that's not just with influencers, that's almost any vendor partner. If they don't know what's going on, they're not going to know why you're asking certain questions. So it's always just good to make sure that communication is happening. So here's a long list, Ethan, but what should be included in influencer contract? Like, what's a bare necessity? You have to have X, Y, and Z. And you can pull things from this list, or if there are things not in this list, that would be good to know. But like, what are essentials for influencer contracts?
Yeah, I'll give you guys both a really high level thing that needs to be part of your contracts. Then I'll give you a specific one that I see that's coming up more and more often in today's day and age. At the end of the day, whether you're a brand or an influencer, you obviously want to make a good deal, meaning a good business deal. From a legal perspective, it's not as important, at least from my eyes, whether you get a good deal or a bad deal. That's kind of up to you from a business perspective. But what's really important is that you have a good contract, meaning that your contract is clear. Ryan talked about getting the expectations right from the beginning. And I think that that's the perfect place to start. We always say start with the end in mind. But the worst thing that you can have in a contract is ambiguity, meaning it's unclear what the expectations are about the parties or what you can do. And so I know from a brand's perspective, I just spoke with a client last week, and they're like, look, we usually don't have a contract with the influencer the first time we do business with them. But if we have a repeat situation, then we have a contract later. But what happens is, if the terms of the deal aren't clear and the influencer is unsure about exactly when they should be posting, the types of content that they should be posting, how long the content needs to appear on their profile, whether they can take a reel on Instagram and remove it from the feed after a certain period of time. If there are things that are unclear, things go wrong. And Ryan earlier mentioned a point of, before getting into a contract, we both have visions, and then we see something on paper and it helps to clarify things. And there's a meme that goes around on the internet. It's like one person's looking at a 6 and the other person is looking at it as a 9, being like, hey, we're seeing different things. And so I think the most important thing from a high level perspective is to make sure that your contracts are clear, that they're detailed, and that both parties understand exactly what their responsibilities are and what they have to do. Now, for a specific legal provision, taking a look at this list, I think one of the most important ones that we're seeing lately is what Ryan has here as usage rights, or what we might call legally as a license, meaning a brand hires a creator to create content. The question is always, what can the brand do with that content? Does the creator still own it? Does the brand just have permission to use it on the feed? Can the brand also post it on their website? Can the brand run an advertising campaign behind it? Can the brand modify that content to suit their needs? If there's not clarity over the usage rights or the license or permission to use the content, people generally get upset later, because then a creator is going to say, whoa, I didn't realize that you could do that with my content. If so, I would have charged a higher fee. And so being specific and being clear, particularly when it comes to usage rights or a license, really is going to help remove a lot of that ambiguity and make sure that people are exactly sure what the deal is going to be at the time that they sign the contract.
Yeah, I think even on that specific example, for the brands that we have here, I'm sure that they have this experience of, but when I ask for perpetual usage rights, all of a sudden it gets very, very expensive. And I think the context you need to have, and hopefully the influencers here will appreciate me sort of having their back. If it's that high value that you want that, there's just a cost to that, right? Like it can't be that high value, but you get it for nothing, right? Like we're sort of past that point of a few years ago where maybe it was okay for the influencer, like they used it as a platform to grow themselves. They don't always think about your brand as that anymore, right? They're thinking about themselves much more personally. And so just come to alignment. And I think that's where, if you have an influencer that this is what you want to do and you just simply don't have budget, that's where you have to be candid. I just can't do that. What can we do? What is reasonable here? Here's what we're trying to achieve. And you might have to move on. You might have to find a different influencer, somebody that does align with the budget and that sort of need of perpetual usage. We want to put this in some of our social media. We want to incorporate this into our advertising and on other platforms. But just reconcile that if it's that high value, then you should be okay a little bit with investing more, unless you simply don't have the money, and then it's just a discussion you have to come to.
Yeah, I'll give you just a really quick actual use case that happened with me a couple of weeks ago. I wanted to work with a creator. I had a particular budget for a project, and I wanted ownership of the content because I wanted to put this into a larger product that's there. And in the very beginning, I kind of put out the scope to the creator. I said, kind of, here's what I'm looking for. And initially, they gave me their ballpark rates. And then I said, it's also important that I want to be able to retain ownership. And they said, no problem. My rates are the same, plus 20% increase, and you can have exclusive ownership of that content. And I said, great. That was within my initial budget. We're all on the same page. The creator was happy because they got a 20% bump on what they were going to initially charge me. I was happy because I have the usage rights that I wanted at the end of the day. And both parties are now ecstatic. And so being clear and transparent and truthful in the process. People think sometimes we want to hide the ball, that we're going to get a better deal if we don't kind of disclose all the details, and ultimately we kind of get a one-up. But it's not going to work for this deal, and it's not going to work for our reputation, and it's not going to work for future deals with that creator or that brand or that agency in the future, because they're not going to be able to trust us. So being upfront and transparent and honest always helps us to get to the right deal, even if this particular deal isn't the right one for us for certain details.
Yeah, and the last thing I would add to this would be, if you're struggling to get that budget, try to quantify, well, what if we wanted to go produce this content with somebody else, what's the cost there? Like, is it really, like, can we do the equivalent, or are we just gonna have to live without it? Because a lot of times you might say, well, my boss said that this is the budget, this is all that we have. It doesn't mean that you can go somewhere else and just find all of what you want. You might find, hey, it's actually better to give them an extra $4,000 for this post, because if we want to recreate it ourselves with somebody, it's going to cost just as much money, way more time and effort, and it's not going to be as authentic or valuable. So this is maybe a bit more of an exchange that we just hadn't thought about. But I think it's awesome, Ethan, that you pointed this out, because it is something you should be thinking about much more often, especially as you're diving into influencer marketing. It's just a much more common request or expectation than it was, I would say, even 2 years ago. So cool. So Ethan, I could just grab a contract off of Google and just download it, and it's probably okay. Maybe a PDF editor. It looked like it's from a reputable company.
Best legal advice I could give: grab it from Google. Look, when I first opened up my own firm 8 years ago, I've been practicing 15, but 8 years ago, we were talking to a client about website terms and conditions. And they're like, hey, we don't need that. We just went to Google. We copied their website terms and conditions because they have high-priced lawyers. And of course, in taking a look at the website terms and conditions, this company was based out of Miami, and any disputes had to be resolved in the state of California. And so they really kind of found themselves in a situation where they had screwed themselves because of it. This doesn't mean that contracts that you can't find online are bad, or that they're not good starting places. Ryan and I both talked about starting with a template is always a really good idea, and you might find a good template. But I think at the end of the day, we need to be able to start with something that is going to be a really good baseline that's going to protect us, and then we can customize it later. And so if you're just taking a contract that you found on Google, you really don't know, is this going to protect me or is it not going to protect me? And that's usually where seeking advice of a lawyer comes in.
Yeah, and I think we actually have a good template that we worked with lawyers to build, but even then, it's still a matter of like, you need to give this to your legal team to make sure it's appropriate for you. There's no getting around combing, like a legal counsel combing through it to make sure, just so that you avoid anything prickly. It's not too bad if you have some in-house counsel. Maybe it's going to cost you a few $100 to find somebody out-house, but the preservation, like the value there, if something was to go wrong, it's much more than that couple of hours that they're going to spend just combing through and saying, yeah, this looks good. It almost feels like insurance. Yep, I feel good about this. We can move forward. Let's just make some tweaks. It's just a small investment. All right, so back to our group. We're 26 minutes in now, so hopefully folks have woken up a little bit more. They've finished eating their lunch. Want to ask, how often are you using contracts? Especially Marley, Garrett, Gabby, Trisha, you guys responded before. We've got many more folks live. It'd be great to see some perspective around using them all the time or using them pretty often. You never use them. This is a safe place, and I will also assure you that it's not uncommon to not use them at all, or to think, oh, it's okay, I just send product out, it's no big deal. So you're not sitting alone over there, but there might be a time to graduate. Looks like for the most part, all of our responses are A. We're using them always. And then we've got Marley's not yet, but going to be doing them as they do their upcoming campaign. But A's across the board. I think that we've got Ethan's approval to move forward to the next slide. So.
Yeah, and even Marley's comment's great too, which is, look, we're all at different phases. And so to have the awareness and to be here on this webinar and be able to learn from Ryan about Hype Auditor and about the importance of having these contracts really is a great step.
So now we're going to go into a handful of like real scenarios. I'll read through like, hey, here's the situation. And then we can read through or actually I'd love to hear from Ethan, like what would have been in his mind an ideal situation to start with, right? This may not be the ultimate conflict resolution, but these are actually some pretty common scenarios, but we actually got this feedback from clients themselves on like how a contract either saved them or they kind of wish, I wish I had sent this over to legal and spent a couple of hours and maybe was a day behind, but I would have been in a better spot. So we're going to go through some of these examples. Go ahead and begin thinking about your questions as we're going through this as well. Go ahead and drop them in the comments. We can have those ready to go towards the end of the webinar, but we're just going to jump into some practical use cases now. So case one, you sort of even alluded to this, Ethan, as maybe a common scenario. Influencer removed the content from the feed, specifically removed a reel from the feed the next day after it's released, and they think that they have a loophole that says, I didn't, violate what I agreed to, but I'm not leaving this in the feed anymore. No contract in place. And so now the brand is ultimately left without probably the residual value that they thought they would get from it living in the feed, but no contract to protect them. I don't know, in this scenario, right, we have identified like being very, very specific with what your expectations are. Here's what we need for this investment to make sense. That's what we've called out, but I don't know if in this scenario or if you've got actual use cases where this has happened, like what was the ultimate resolution that you came to?
Yeah, this is exactly one of those prime examples where the influencer contract, the legal terms themselves were probably good, but there was ambiguity in what exactly the services were that the influencer had to perform. And so I would say, Ryan and I talked for maybe about 10 minutes before the program today, and he's like, I'm not going to throw any like curveballs at you by giving me statistics, but if you have statistics, feel free to throw them out. And I would say that probably like 8 out of 10 times that I'm reviewing a brand's proposed contract with an influencer or vice versa, my feedback usually is it's not specific enough exactly what the creator is going to do with that content or the conditions around the use of that content. And so in this particular situation, it likely said they had to be able to post it on the feed, but didn't say it had to remain up there on the feed. And so I think it goes back into one of our initial examples of wanting to be as clear and as detailed as possible. And in this particular case, if a client came into the situation and said it wasn't clear, I'm likely going to say to the client, look, the situation sucks. We could probably improve this situation by expanding the details of your contracts in the future to be clear on how long this needs to be able to stay in the feed. And if this influencer doesn't want to put this back up on their feed, you might not have a great legal case because it's a little bit ambiguity, but you're not going to work with this creator anymore. Now I would kind of go back to the creator and be like, look, this shouldn't be a deal breaker because we've got more content and more deals to create. And if we can't work this out, then this is probably going to be our last deal together. And it's probably not going to be a good practice for you getting other deals from other larger brands as well. So coming to a practical resolution in a situation like this where the contract is unclear is probably the best way to resolve the situation.
I would even, and this will be an underline for future use cases, but you could have ambiguity and it hasn't even affected you yet, but it's still worthwhile going through and saying, like, is this completely clear? When you were talking, Ethan, I was reminded of that oldish YouTube video of like a programmer dad trying to get his son to think about programming. He's like, make a sandwich. And so he goes, yeah, you just make a sandwich. It's like, no, you have to do all of these steps. This is how you get to that spot so that's completely clear. So when you're programming that, the application does exactly what you want it to do and doesn't break. But it's the same idea here, being very specific. And so if you feel like, hey, it's never been a problem before, it still doesn't mean it's not worth looking over and going, have we been fortunate? Have we found the right partnerships where maybe this could be a problem though if we find the wrong partnership? And there is that benefit of like, at least not to work with that person again if they're not aligned with addressing the terms and meeting your needs, but hopefully just avoid that in general.
Mm-hmm.
So guaranteed views, right? It's pretty common to do that. Sometimes it doesn't work out for an influencer, right? They feel like I've got this sort of recipe for getting views. This is what it's going to do. And then it doesn't meet that need. Brand expectation, you're going to make me a new video. Influencer's expectation, I'll just repost the same video. I don't want to make a new video. What's the problem here? Like it's the same thing, but it definitely feels like to the brand, I should have gotten something new. You did not deliver. And so now you're giving me sort of like 2 subpar products don't make a good product. I want 2 products. But in this case, right, you sort of left with the situation as it is. Well, you're just getting views, right? You didn't say videos. So I don't know if you had any comments there, Ethan, or thoughts just based off of what we pulled out.
Yeah, everybody wanted this to work out. When we hired the influencer to create this video, we wanted to achieve the objectives. The brand wanted to get the exposure. The influencer wanted to get paid for their content. And now we found a situation where it didn't achieve the results, and that stinks. But it also happens sometimes. And so really, at the very beginning, when Ryan asked me, why do we have a contract? Purpose is, if something goes wrong, we want to be able to go back to it. And so one thought that you might have in watching this webinar is think of contracts as what happens if things go wrong, or how can I hedge against the worst case scenarios, which is I invested 10 grand in this video and it underperformed even based upon this creator's metrics of how their content is performing. And so you may be able to then think, how can we hedge against this worst case scenario? So we put something into the agreement to say, if this video does not hit these particular metrics, then we would like you to create a new video, post it on different platforms, tweak the video, do something. So it's clear in the beginning what you want the creator to do. And then the creator has the opportunity to say, look, I was kind of just thinking this was going to be one video. But if you really want me to have to create a second video, then the contract might say, if this doesn't hit these metrics, then the creator creates a new video, but the brand pays, a small additional fee to be able to cover that. So even if that doesn't get triggered, and the best case scenario happens where you hit that exposure and it doesn't trigger the need for the second video, the parties were still clear as to what was going to be done in that worst case scenario, and they had the chance to negotiate that with eyes wide open before they got into the original deal.
That's great. Case 3, I think that this, if you've ever worked in sales with those money transfer companies that always take their little percentage, right? That this can happen where I was expecting this fixed fee, but it showed up with 4.5% less than what I was expecting it to show up with. Whoever's paying it, right? The brand might be thinking, this is what I promised, right? I paid this amount. I didn't promise you more than that. How do we sort of overcome any sort of miscommunication here? Because I do think the trick here too is, but no one wants to pay this extra amount, right? So we don't want the transfer company to win in this case. No offense to PayPal or anybody like that, but we wanted to find some alignment. But how do you overcome like that situation? Like we're talking about actually a variance in fees here, and if it's a 5-figure contract, that can be quite expensive. In addition to what you've agreed to.
It can, and that's why I think thinking about these things in advance helps. When I first opened up my own law firm back in 2015, I remember the first time that I got paid with a credit card, it was 3% less. And I was like, man, that stinks. And I went to kind of my business development guy in the beginning, and I'm like, hey, can we like change the contract to put this on the client? And he looked at me and he's like, look, this is the cost of doing business. So I think an assumption of where you start from is that you're likely going to have to deal with that small percentage unless you address it within the contract. And so I would just assume if I'm going to be using PayPal as a creator, that I'm going to be losing this percentage of fees, and you should either A, take that into account when you are telling people what your fees are, or making it clear in the contract who's responsible for those fees. Absent one of those two things, it really comes down to a cost of doing business thing. And just know that that's probably the baseline of where this would be resolved if there wasn't clarity within the contract. But I do think it's important to either cake that into your price or include a contractual provision if that really is going to be something that's material to the deal at the end of the day.
Yeah, and generally speaking, as like a person with a marketing and sales background, I would recommend not calling it out. Try to build it in, because no one wants to see that line item because it doesn't feel like a value, right? Just incorporate it, and no one will complain about it. But when you call it out that, well, I don't want this, and then you wind up in the same spot, or you live with, being paid by check, right? You could do that. That's an option. But now you're thinking about, well, what's the cost of waiting? Is it worth 2 weeks versus just getting the payment now? It's up to you to decide. But there are some options there. But definitely keep that in mind. Our questions are coming in quick, Ethan. So we'll hop through these next few, and then we'll jump over to the questions from folks. We don't want to keep everybody for the full time. So why don't we do this one, and then we'll jump over to questions. We'll skip some of our other cases. We'll share this presentation following the webinar, folks. So if you want to see the other cases that we have called out, you can take a look at them. But case number 4, if a video that a brand's using is only, let's see here, be sure to add a clause to the contract stating that the brand can be the only sponsor of the video, right? So partnered with somebody, I see their YouTube video go live. We get to the mid-roll. There's our ad. There's another ad. There's another ad. There's another ad. Wait a minute. We've diluted what I was doing here. I thought like maybe I was first, and that's great. Or worse, you're fourth, right? How do you manage that expectation? I think it sort of underlines what we've been saying the whole time, but we can touch on that and then we'll jump over to questions.
Yeah, totally. Creators don't do this. Meaning, like, look, if someone is surprised that this happens, we're probably not in a really great situation. But of course, we want to be as clear as possible in the contract. But I think having a clause like this, making sure that you have exclusivity. Usually what we have is an exclusivity clause. An exclusivity clause might say, for this content or for a week or whatever it is, we're going to be the only, handbag brand that you're promoting on your account for these few days or whatever it's going to be, because we know that you are a fashion influencer and that's going to be there. But having an exclusivity clause, that's not going to say, it's not going to be unreasonable to where the influencer is not going to want to do the deal, but something that helps you to accomplish your business objectives is smart, and it puts people on the same page. And if they have some pushback and say, look, can I also do this? You have the chance to negotiate that in advance and not be surprised.
Awesome. So I'm going to remove the presentation here. Let's just jump over to Q&A, do the most of the time. I think that this is really valuable. Again, go ahead and put your questions in here. I'll share our contact information. We've got a couple of slides that we can show sort of housekeeping at the end there, but just so you can see our full faces. First question that we have that has come in is, how different do influencer contracts have to be when they're international collaborations versus US-based ones? So maybe this is a curveball, Ethan, because I wasn't prepared for that one. But yeah, sometimes you're finding influencers. I mean, they're influencers, right? They have this global reach, and so they might just happen to also have a more nomadic business as yourself. How do you handle this? Are they wildly different?
Sure. First, as to hard questions, I'm going to quote one of my heroes, The Rock. Bring it. Not afraid of the hard questions. May not have all the answers, but here to address them. So in this situation, I'm a US-based lawyer, so I can really speak to US law. What I usually tell people is you should craft the contract for the jurisdiction that you're in. So if you're in the US, you need to make sure that it complies with US laws. But if you are going to be working with an international influencer, and this campaign is going to reach a particular jurisdiction, like let's say France, for example, and you're going to be doing a lot of business there, you may want to consult with an attorney in France who focuses on influencer law to make sure that there aren't any special nuances that you should be aware of. Here in the US, and I know that there are questions about this, so we can dive into it in more detail, the Federal Truth in Advertising laws, or the FTC, is the one that governs influencer laws. It really comes from the FTC and from general contract law, are the two laws that are at issue here. So from a US perspective, we need to make sure that an influencer complies by clearly and conspicuously disclosing the nature of the sponsored relationship in the post. It's one thing that's really important, and it's one thing that we focus on in the contracts to make sure that we're compliant. When you deal with these international jurisdictions, they might have other nuances that you don't know about. So it's important to know. But I think starting with complying with the jurisdiction where you exist, some people in the Philippines, I saw a gentleman from Nova Scotia, that's going to be important as well to make sure that you've crossed your I's and dotted your T's.
Are deal memos still necessary prior to final contracts these days, or does discussing things over email suffice, generally speaking?
Yeah, deal memos, not necessary, not a legal requirement. As Ryan said at the beginning, it's great to get on the same page and know that the general terms of a deal are what they are, and then move particularly to a contract phase. So a deal memo helps. It's also not necessary. Coming up with the details over email is totally fine. But one thing that's really important is that within your clause, within your contract, you have a clause that says that everything that's in this contract is the deal, and then any prior discussions that we may have, are not included. This is really kind of a catch-all provision to make sure that if someone was unclear about the conversations over the phone or in the email, it's called an integration clause, that everything is integrated in the contract, and to be sure to correct those things and never rely upon someone saying, oh, don't worry about it. That's totally fine, because if the contract says something else, they could potentially hold your feet to the fire for what's in the contract.
This next one, I think it probably hits somewhere sort of sensitive for lots of brands, because you sort of see things a little bit, still feel a little Wild West out there, depending on the type of partnerships. but are in-app paid partnership buttons sufficient, or should influencers still include hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored in their copy, with text overlay in the video to comply with FTC guidelines? I know that it's still, for some brands, it's like no one, my competitor's not doing it, I don't want to do it, but right, like what's the right thing to be happening?
All right, Ryan, mark your calendar. It is Thursday, September 21st, 2023 at 1:45 Eastern Standard Time. I say that because I'm going to tell you what the law is now. And then as this webinar continues to pick up more views later and the law evolves, be able to catch up. Okay, the legal answer, according to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, who releases periodic updates on the state of influencer law, they say that these in-app partnership things that say sponsored post or paid post, they say that's not enough, according to their website as it exists today. Now, you're asking the social media lawyer. I'm going to say, look, that's what the FTC says. Therefore, you should still include hashtag ad or sponsored or other language above the fold in your post to make sure it's compliant. Now, I'm taking off my lawyer hat and I'm talking to you as an actual human being. The ones that I see on Instagram where it says sponsored post or paid post really kind of is part of it, where like the location would be, seems pretty darn clear and conspicuous to me. It's above the fold, it's clear language. I feel like eventually the FTC is going to modify their advice. The reason they don't do it is because Instagram is different from TikTok, which is different from Facebook, which is different from Twitter, which is now X, and now there's Threads. So it's really hard for them to say, yeah, sure, whatever the social media sites put is going to be good enough, because they don't know how it works. And so I see larger brands still requiring their creators to put that in there. And at this time, I'm going to say it's better to be safe than sorry, and to still include it, even though us in the industry know that that's probably clear enough. We don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we didn't take that extra step and we put ourselves at risk. So if you do just rely on that, no, it seems pretty reasonable, but there still is some degree of risk that might be there if you don't have your creator put it in the content themselves.
All right, we have a question around exclusivity from Ori. Should it start at the engagement date rather than the first live date to cover us from having influencer engage with potential competitors prior to that content being live? Or is it the live? Like, where is the date? And is this just you just have to be specific type question?
Yeah, it's really hard for contracts to require people to do things retroactively. For example, there's a new law in Illinois that just got published. It's coming out in 2024, and it requires parents to hold a certain amount of money for child influencers, to make sure that they're held in a specific trust account so that the children get this. And people were commenting on our Instagram page and our YouTube page saying, wow, this should really apply retroactively. And I was like, I agree with you, but it's really hard to be able to do that. And so I think that asking an influencer to give you exclusivity and have them go back through all of their past content's probably an unreasonable request, and one that's very hard to enforce. And it might be more important for you as the brand to review that influencer's content and make sure that your placement with other past products being there is not going to create a bad or poor brand image for you. I do think that depending upon who the influencer is, the size of your campaign, and the size of the fee, it is reasonable to ask for exclusivity for a specific duration. And look, an influencer or creator can make a bad deal and give you exclusivity for a year, 2 years, 3 years for only having your product in a particular industry, because maybe they really want that deal. Maybe they really need that payment and they're willing to give that up for something else. But I think at the end of the day, if you take something away from this part of the webinar, it's good business to be reasonable. And so having a reasonable exclusivity clause that makes sense for the brand and your goals, what Ryan talked about, and something that's going to work with this creator and others in the future is going to work. And probably asking for past exclusivity would not be seen as reasonable in the industry.
we're going to do about 3 more questions, and then we're going to share contact information if folks have some more. We don't want to keep everybody the whole time. So one question, and this I think is actually a pretty common, it feels like it's going to be a nuanced answer, but if you're paying an influencer and they don't fulfill their obligations, you just withhold payment. If I send them a gift and they don't do it, what's like a recourse for this? I mean, stick it in the mail. Like, what's the common thing for enforcing a non-compliance, or maybe even if it's very variable, like what's a typical resolution? Because this might be good for brands that do very often send things out and have never really run into problems before, but may run into a problem.
Yeah, I'll give you a crazy example, but a real example. We had represented an ENT surgeon who was doing plastic surgery on influencers, and one of the deals that they made was, we'll give you this this procedure, and you've got to create this content. And the question was, what happened if they didn't live up to their deal and create the content? Now that they've already had the plastic surgery done, you're not going to like take the nose off. And so, how we dealt with it in that situation was, we said, in the event of non-performance, the value of what you received was X, and that you would be required to pay for X within a certain period of time, or else this would be a breach of contract, and we have the ability to kind of enforce this. So know if you're going to send product, you probably aren't getting it back, but you can build into the contract the estimated or approximate retail value of the things that they send them, and that this can either be deducted from payment for partial non-performance, or you can require that they reimburse you for that amount if they don't perform. But just know, if you don't address it in the contract and you send them the stuff, it's really kind of SOL. And you can Google, if you're international, what SOL means, so that we keep this a PG-13 program. But let's just say you're not in a great legal position if it's not clarified.
Yeah, I've actually talked to folks that work at luxury brands, luxury handbags, or even jewelry, and they usually build it, like the expectation is like, I'm not giving you a $5,000 necklace. Like, I'm not. You're going to send it back, and so there could be some, if you've got context, how do you incorporate? Because maybe I'm sending grills, maybe I'm sending things that are pretty valuable, but I'm just curious how I structure this. I think that the luxury goods space, they've tackled it a bit as well, because things are just very, very expensive. So cool. Let's jump down. What options? So we got 2 questions left, and then we'll wrap up today. What options do we have for creating accountability to deadlines and contracts? Timelines are always in RTA. Tried writing in pay reduction clauses, which are always redlined out. How do you keep people on time?
Yes. 2 ways that we've dealt with this. Look, deadlines are deadlines. And at the end of the day, a legal contract is a legal contract. And so being able to kind of enforce the contract through having what I might call payment tiers, a payment schedule. Maybe there's an initial payment that's made, but then the next one doesn't come until those deadlines are met. I will tell you, creators, big or small, are incentivized to fulfill the contract if it's contingent upon receiving that payment. And so one way that you might be able to handle it is that way. Now let's look at this from a practical perspective. We're working with a major beverage brand, is working with a major television celebrity that's super popular and perhaps known to be less reliable. And we wanted to both get the deal done, even if they didn't meet their deadlines, but also build in a reasonable amount of wiggle room. What we did in that instance is we set forth what the deadlines were, and we included a wiggle room clause and say, look, if the performance doesn't occur during these particular dates, the agency's not going to be held liable because it's outside of our control, or things of that nature. But the parties are promised to work together within a reasonable period of time to reschedule these deadlines, and then included, like, if it's not performed after that time. or by this date, then it's going to be a breach of contract, because there are all these other contingencies that are built into receiving this contract to go into a large national brand. And so non-performance can happen. Payment tiers is one way to deal with it. Addressing it in advance in the best possible way is another way to deal with it. But sometimes it's just a breach of contract, and it sucks. But remember, your contracts hedge you against your worst case scenarios. And so, yes, they may redline these things out, but Ryan talked about being transparent in the beginning and having the contracts with their reps to say, look, this is going to be put into a larger program. This is really important, and we would love to work with your creator. But if we don't find a way to be able to work this out, it's going to be a non-starter. And we don't want to get to that position. So how can we work this out in a way that's going to be able to hedge against those potentially foreseen unexpected events?
Yeah, the last thing I would add is don't try to use these things as like an excuse for poor planning. If you're behind the eight ball and you need something done tomorrow, trying to throw this in there isn't going to be like a good self-preservation thing either. It's just you have to get out in front of this process as well. Be reasonable with dates. Understand there are other things that have to happen. If you're talking about production in a YouTube video, they're not going to be able to do it a certain day. Like there's just other variables, and so just be realistic. But the last question, I think it's a good question to end on for the group. I don't think you necessarily know the answer to it, but I think you've got a good feel from your experience working in this space, especially as a social media lawyer for the past 8 years. How frequently do FTC guidelines change? And is there a good way to get notifications? I think notifications is probably pretty straightforward, but I'd love to hear how often is this like notable change a thing? Is it rarely? Is it once a year? Is it like Google SEO updates where it's like every 3 months there's a huge change? What's the typical life cycle?
Yeah, I would say the first major release from the FTC came out a few years ago, and the last major update came out about a year ago. So I wouldn't say that these things get updated all the time. I would say at this point, annually is like a reasonable expectation. I wish there was a way for the FTC to like give me updates. I guess you could subscribe to them on X or Twitter or Threads and hope for that. And I don't mean that tongue in cheek. I just mean that Googling as easy as FTC influencer guidelines or testimonial guidelines or social media guidelines, you're going to find the link. You're going to see when it was most recently active. And I would check there. Shameless plug, follow the social media law firm on social media, and we'll do our best to kind of update you. But really, I think that's the best way, is to just periodically check, and it's likely going to be in the news. Usually when the FTC makes a big update, like fining Kim Kardashian for $1.25 million for not following the law, they do a press release, and the media picks up on this stuff. And for us in the industry, it is important to kind of see what the FTC looks like. And so it's not a Google thing where, oh my gosh, has this changed? And I've got to completely rework things on a week-to-week basis. But I would say annually and periodically, it's important to check and keep tabs on it, especially if we're in this industry.
Yeah. Let me pull up these slides. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have a few resources and links that I'm going to post into the comments. We have that sort of starting point template. This is not the perfect contract to go immediately roll out into anybody, but this is the perfect starting point to reach out to someone like Ethan or your in-house counsel and say, here's what we have as a starting point. Can we use some of this? What do we need to change? Here's what we're thinking about from relationships. So if you're starting from zero, take a look at the link I just shared to that Drive folder. We also have a glossary of terms if anything wasn't clear. Here's our contact information once again. I'm also going to drop a link to Ethan's website where he dives into specifically social media law, working with influencers. So you could definitely check him out. He's open for business currently in Boulder. We're slightly north of Boulder, but maybe relocating soon. I really appreciate your time, Ethan, joining me today. It was, I think, an awesome experience for folks to learn lots of things, ask lots of questions. We did go a full hour, even though I promised you it was not probably going to be the full hour, but I appreciate that time Thank you everybody for joining us today. We're going to end the stream, but feel free to send this link along to your colleagues. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, me on the influencer side, Ethan on the law side, and we will see you guys next time.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.